headline, so to speak, is that we want the player to make headlines. And that's very much what we're doing here, which is, you're interviewing me, we're talking about the game. In the game, we've got a new character who's going to interview the player. And whatever you get asked and whatever you respond will feed very heavily into the new career systems that we've implemented in the game.
How is it going to work? I think this sounds really, really cool, but how is it? Is it going to be dialogue options?
Yeah, so basically you'll get a number of options on screen that you'll select using the D-pad. You'll maybe get a maximum of 4 choices, but as you progress through your career, we'll open up some of the options you can refer to as well. So we're basing it very much on the character of the player. So we're giving the player the scope to become very sportsmanlike, or very showman-like. So the answers, depend on what sort of a character you are. So it may be I come into a season and say, I'm going to own everybody, I'm going to be the best driver in the world ever. So you're very showman-like. Or it may be you come in and you say, we'll start out small, we'll work our way up, we'll start winning, and that shows that you're very much a sportsman.
So how is that going to actually affect the career? Are people going to react to you differently?
So some teams will want a driver who exhibits a certain character, but also the way in which you motivate your team will also come through from that. So it may be if I'm not performing very well as a driver, but I'm being really, really crass about what I'm saying, I'm not motivating my team well. So it's maybe they get offended by the comments I make, and that decreases my reputation with the team. It demotivates the departments. I don't get the R&D sort of things that I require. I don't get other teams interested in me.
That actually sounds really fun to me, but can I ask how it's going to be paced throughout the career? Will it be after every race or after every tournament?
No, definitely not after every there's multiple sessions, obviously, over the race weekend, and we don't want to just do it every session because that's not realistic. So if you've done something, obviously, of specific note, or if there are big season changes happening, if drivers are doing well or doing badly, that will prompt questions. But obviously, we don't want to overload the player with things in between the sessions.
Can I ask who you have returning in terms of sponsorships and partnerships?
Sorry?
Sponsorships. What brands are we going to see?
So the way in which we're doing this in the game is obviously we've got all of the official sponsors and brands that come with Formula One. But for the contract itself, you have a value yourself as a player. And what you can do then is you can barter with the teams to get a better position. So essentially, I might be driving for Force India, for example, and I want to get better R&D performance from the team, and I want to get, so I might go to the team boss and say, I want to renegotiate my contract, I want to get a better deal, and I promise I will hit these goals.
Wow.
And they might come back and say, no, you're never going to hit those, we're not accepting that, you need to renegotiate. So we've got a full contract negotiations system in there.
How did you guys come up with this idea, and how difficult was it to implement? Because it's obviously very different to everything else that you've done.
So the implementation is incredibly complex because there's so many systems that all intertwine. So everything the player says to the press impacts on one area or another. So eventually they all sort of come together in one big melting pot. But the inspiration behind it is very much what you see in Formula One.
Yeah.
I mean, the sport just has so much to offer, and we always want to try and represent that in the game in a way that's appealing to gamers.
So did you guys kind of pay attention to certain interview styles and certain player responses to sort of crowdsource how you would put this in?
I mean, very much so. I think the most obvious thing is that the drivers all have very different characters, and especially how they react to the media and how when they're interviewed, the way that they present themselves. And that's what actually gave us the idea to, see how the player would behave, not just in really straight answers like, do you think the team are doing well? Do you think the R&D department are doing well? But in a more characterful way. So, are you exhibiting sportsmanship or are you exhibiting showmanship?
I really like it because it's basically not just a literal F1 driver simulator. You now actually, the whole package. I think that's really cool. So I did want to ask, there have been some changes to F1, safety changes specifically. How are those being implemented in the game?
Yeah, so as always, there's always changes in the sport, and there's been quite a few this year. The halo being one of the most pronounced visual changes to the cars. And a lot of the fans have been asking what we're going to do with the halo. So what we've actually done is the halo's present on all of the cars. We represent the sport correctly. That's part of the sport. It's one of the big additions this year. But if you're playing in cockpit camera, obviously that can be quite an obscuring item in the front of of your vision. So we actually allow the player to disable the central column of the halo.
Oh, interesting.
And it actually frames the image really well. It frames the world really nicely, which is good. We've also added in, obviously, this year the new tyre compounds. There's 2 new compounds. And we've also got 2 new circuits in the game, so Hockenheim's returning.
Yes, people are very excited about that.
Well, Hockenheim's a classic Formula One circuit. It's super fun. But we've also got Paul Ricard, which is a new circuit this year.
So when it comes to aesthetics specifically, every time that there's a new game, every time there's a new F1 game, I'm like, man, it looks so good. How are you guys going to make it look better? So what are some of the graphical updates we've got this time around?
Yeah, I think that's one of the most obvious things this year. is that we've done lots and lots of small things that in isolation wouldn't really make a big impact. But I mean, as you can probably see from the image there on the screen, you know, we've added in simple things like the fogging in the environment. From the long cameras, you'll see things like the heat haze from the track and from the back of the cars. You'll see the effect of the mirage on the track surface that you see when a camera pulls back in real life.
It's so cool.
Yeah, so you know, we're adding all of these little touches that when you see it all together, it looks like a, you know, a real image of Formula One.
It's going to sound like a really weird question, but when you're working on these games, you know, annually, do you ever have a thing where maybe last year you had an idea that you couldn't figure out how to implement, and you're like, we'll save it for 2018?
Yeah.
That's a system?
Oh, I've got lists and lists of things, and so we have so many that sometimes I forget them, so I've just got lists of things everywhere.
How are you guys liking working on PS Pro and Xbox One X?
That's great. I mean, every time somebody gets more power to play with, you feel it. You know, and obviously now we're quite a way into this generation, which is why we're able to get the sort of visuals that you're seeing now.
Are there any things that you really wanted to put in the game that you maybe couldn't, that you are willing to talk about?
There's always things. I mean, that's why we can always build on the franchise and we can always improve the game year on year, because we're never short of ideas.
So in terms of handling, physics is so important. What's new this year?
Yeah, so we always push it every year, always come up with something different. So probably the big changes this year is we've added the Ers Management for the driver. So obviously in the real sport, they manage the deployment of their battery levels, so the amount of power that they get from the batteries. And we've added that for the player. So there's an auto mode for players who don't want the complexity, but then there's obviously the 5 modes that a more skilled driver can play with. We've also continued to work on the tyre model and the suspension. So suspension-wise, we're running at a higher refresh rate now, so that runs at 1,000 hertz. So when you hit the curbs, you really feel the impact of the car hitting the curb.
Yeah.
We've also worked on the bump stops, which may sound like a really strange thing to talk about. But, you know, the bump stop in suspension's a key component, you know, so we've remodeled how they work. And then we've gone as far as taking the tyre temperature. So instead of it just being the exterior temperature, it's actually the carcass temperature, which can actually, you know, over a long period of time, increase and decrease.
Broad picture, how do you do all of that? You know, this all sounds so technical. You have to be so accurate. Do you guys do a lot of real-world testing with these cars?
So we have to get really good access to the drivers, and we've got a great relationship with Formula One. So some of their technical guys have been into the studio in the last sort of few months, and we've gained loads of great insight, in particular into how suspension on a Formula One car works, how the loads work based on the aero, and that's really helped us to, you know, to build what we've got this year.
So I have to ask, classic cars, what are we getting?
So the ones that we had last year are all returning to the game this year. And post E3, we will talk about the new ones that we're adding to the game.
Yet. Well, are there any more new additions that we're going to see that you can talk about?
So I think new additions outside of that as well. We've also got the super license for the online play. So we're always going to try and clean up the online gameplay. And obviously, it's a very challenging game. And you want people match made against drivers of similar caliber. So we're adding what we term in the super license, which rates the driver based on their driver skill. And also their sort of driver etiquette, and then we'll use an ELO-based matchmaking system to match drivers against racers of similar skill levels.
How complicated is that system?
It's too complicated for me to understand.
Someone much smarter is at home working on that.
I said, this is what we'd like, please, and the intelligent people went off and coded it.
So what else are you guys doing to kind of foster the competitive community?
So we've obviously got our esports championship into its 2nd season now. So last year that was incredible.
Absolutely. I was honestly kind of shocked by just how engaged everyone was as that was going down.
Yeah, I mean, first season we had, that was enormous. And this year we've gone bigger already. So we've already had 4 qualifying rounds. We've now got the pool of drivers who are going to go through to the pro draft. And they'll be selected by the teams who are entering the championship.
Can I ask what your kind of long-term goals are, or just, I guess, even short-term? What are you trying to get out of that competitive scene?
I think everybody's trying to get something out of it, slightly different maybe. I mean, obviously we want great people playing the game. We want more exposure of the game. We want people to get more competitive and enjoy what they're doing. You know, for the sport, it actually broadens the audience brilliantly, because gamers are obviously a little bit younger than maybe some of the existing Formula One fans. But ultimately, it's a great spectacle. You know, it's just as much fun to watch real Formula One as it is to watch our virtual races. I mean, we've even built our own broadcast suite in the studio so that we can actually run the races in the evening. And we've appointed a guy who actually handles all of that.
I don't know if you'll be able to answer this, but this is kind of an interesting jumping off point. Have you found that there have been people who have been fans of the game series who've then gotten into F1?
Oh yeah, definitely.
It's really cool.
In fact, we've often found that really heavily internally. You know, you get guys who think they can come and apply the skills that they've picked up in a different genre, in a different style of game, even in sort of mobile, you know, it all crosses over, and they'll come in and they'll be like, well, I don't really understand Formula One. It's like, you'll get it. You'll be working with a team that knows so much about the sport, that are so passionate about the sport.
It just becomes infectious.
It will rub off, yeah.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask, you know, we've been talking a little bit about the competitive scene, but for people who've never played an F1 game before, what do you have to assure those players that it won't be too complicated, that it's not too simulation heavy, and what's the kind of barrier to entry for those people?
So I think probably one of the most interesting things I've had relayed to me just today at the show itself is that people are saying the game is more accessible and easier to play. And I think part of that is the fact that the car handles so naturally, it does what you expect it to do, and therefore it makes it easier to relate to. But it scales incredibly well as well. So, you know, at the easy end of the scale, you know, the game can apply the brakes for you. We've got traction control, ABS. And then at the hardcore end of the scale, there's no hand holding at all.
Yeah.
You know, incredibly difficult. Also, you've got things to worry about, like the fuel weights, the tire temperatures, tire wear, weather conditions. You know, so it scales really well. And I think that's something that, at an event like this, for example, you get a lot of people who maybe haven't played the game, and they play it, and they're pleasantly surprised how they can actually adapt. And one of the strong things I've had back in the last couple of days has been, you do a couple of laps and you're like, this is difficult. You do 3 or 4 laps and you start to get into a flow, and then it just clicks. And you don't realize when it happens, all of a sudden, you're flying around consistently. You know, you're having a great time.
It must be really cool to see that, with like, people actually doing that on the show floor. How does that kind of thing feel?
Oh, it's tremendous.
Yeah.
I mean, we get it every year, and we're certainly pulling in a new audience every year as well. And it's really exciting to see, especially when they sit down in the race cockpit as well, and they've maybe never even used a steering wheel for a racing game. You know, it just elevates the experience.
What is compatibility going to be for peripheral hardware?
As in previous years, you know, we will always strive to support as many of the mainstream wheels out there as we can. Although, including this year, we've gone to some of the extremes and gone for the very expensive, high-end, you know, direct drive wheels that are used in simulators around the world.
That's very cool. It's very exciting for you guys, I imagine. I did want to ask, before we, you know, kind of wrap up the segment, in terms of tutorials, have you guys reworked the tutorial at all?
Yeah, so obviously with things like the ERS, there needs to be a management tutorial for the ERS.
Yeah.
So again, we've recorded tutorials for those that will trigger through the game. So as you go through your career, they will trigger at various points.
Okay, that's smart, because that's a system that I saw people talking about online, and it seems like a difficult thing to do for F1 specifically. You know, it's pretty high-level stuff. To be able to communicate it really clearly with players sounds like a real challenge.
Yeah, I think we've always tried, in particular over the last few years, to introduce as many elements from the sport of Formula One in a way that can be enjoyed by everybody.
Yeah.
You know, and whether that's educating them on how to use them, or actually just applying a level of assistance so that they're still there, but they don't need to consider, you know, too much what they're doing with it.
I mean, you've already spoken to a lot of it, but I want to ask, is there any major lesson that you learnt from F1 2017 that you took going into 2018?
Yeah, I mean, we certainly look and see where people stumble in their career, where they maybe don't progress as far as we think they would like to, or we see, you know, certain elements that aren't engaged with quite as heavily. And I think you'll see that's the structure of the career, the way we've changed some of the point systems and the way the R&D works, for example. So now the R&D, the player can upgrade their car far quicker. But it may be at the end of the season we have a rules change and the whole season order changes. So season 2, you might find teams that are at the top now down the bottom. So that's a more engaging experience for the R&D, you know, and that's something we learned and moved on from last year.
So the answer to that is that you've done a lot.
We've done a lot, yes.
Can I just ask for the final question, what are you most excited about, or what's your favorite thing about the game?
I think that opening scene there where you finally get into the paddock and you get to meet the new press character and you get to see how visually different the game is this year, how the uplift has impacted upon it. And then just that first turn of the wheel, you know, it just feels, it looks right, and it's a total package.
So whereabouts can people check you out on the show floor if they're here at E3?
So unfortunately, I'm not on the show floor.
Oh, no.
I'm upstairs.
You're hidden. Well, I'll come find you later this week.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Okay,
when can we get our hands on the game?
So F1 2018 is out on August the 24th on
That's
PlayStation
my birthday.
4. Is it?
Yeah.
We'll have to send you a free copy.
Thank you. Thank you very much. All right. Thank you so much. For more on everything E3 2018, stay right here on IGN.